9:14 a.m. A small community hospital tucked away near a sprawling naval base on the California coast. The morning fog is still lifting from the parking lot. Inside the administrator's office, Nurse Emily Carter stands with a cardboard box in her hands. The manager doesn't look up from his desk. "We're restructuring the schedule, Emily. We simply don't need an extra nurse on this rotation. We're letting you go." Emily nods once, no argument, and walks toward the exit. But as she reaches the sidewalk, the sky begins to scream. A Navy Seahawk helicopter drops from the clouds, banking hard toward the hospital. The Pacific View Medical Center was a place of routine and quiet rhythms. For Emily Carter, it was meant to be a sanctuary. After 3 grueling deployments supporting naval special warfare groups, she wanted a life where the only pressure she felt was from a blood pressure cuff, not the weight of a dying soldier in a dusty valley. She had been at the hospital for only 6 months, working the overflow shifts and filling in the gaps where the regular staff didn't want to go. She was the one who checked the oxygen levels 3 times when the protocol only required 1. She was the one who noticed a patient's subtle change in skin tone before the monitors even beeped. To the hospital administration, Emily was a ghost. She was efficient, yes. Her patient logs were meticulous, and she never complained about the long hours or the messy trauma cleanups. But because she didn't participate in the loud social circles of the ER or brag about her credentials at the nurses' station, she was labeled as dispensable. In the eyes of Mr. Sterling, the administrator, Emily was just an extra, a luxury that the quarterly budget could no longer sustain in a facility looking to brand itself with more charismatic leaders. "It's about the bottom line, Emily," Sterling had said earlier that morning, his voice dripping with practiced corporate sympathy. He was looking at a spreadsheet, not at her eyes. "We need high-visibility professionals who can lead our public-facing initiatives. You're a bit too quiet. You don't quite fit the leader profile we're looking for in this expansion. Your skills are adequate, but we need more energy." Emily hadn't bothered to explain that real leadership often happens in absolute silence. She had seen real injustice in the world. A corporate layoff was nothing compared to the triage lines she had managed under heavy fire in the Hindu Kush. She simply cleaned out her locker with practiced mechanical movements. A worn stethoscope, a small silver trauma shear set she had carried through 2 sandstorms, and tucked in the far corner of her bag, a faded green patch, the insignia of a combat medic. She had been docked to the most elite warriors on the planet, but here she was just a surplus nurse whose quietness was seen as a lack of ambition. She walked through the lobby, her box held tightly against her chest. Her fellow nurses offered shallow glances of pity, but most looked away, grateful it wasn't them. Emily felt that familiar, biting sense of isolation. It was the same feeling she had when she first processed out of the Navy. The realization that the civilian world values the person who speaks the loudest rather than the person who sees the most. She had just saved a patient in room 4 from a potential drug interaction an hour ago, but that wasn't on Sterling's spreadsheet. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors, the salty California air hit her. She looked at the ocean, wondering if she should just leave nursing altogether. Maybe she wasn't meant for the civilized world where value is determined by a PR profile. Maybe the silence she carried was too loud for people who had never heard the crack of a sniper rifle or the roar of an extraction bird. Suddenly, the windows of the hospital began to rattle. It wasn't the usual high-pitched whine of a civilian air ambulance. This was the aggressive, heavy-duty thrum of twin T-700 engines. An MH-60S Seahawk, painted in tactical gray and salt-crusted from the Pacific spray, was screaming toward the small, civilian-grade concrete pad near the parking lot. The hospital staff ran to the glass. The security guards looked up in confusion. This was a hot landing. The pilot wasn't waiting for a clearance from the local tower. He was coming in flares down, aiming for the deck with a desperate, professional urgency. Emily stopped in the middle of the lot. The wind from the rotors whipped her hair across her face, pulling at her blue scrubs. She didn't run for cover like the others. She stood her ground, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the markings on the tail. It was a bird from the X Squadron, her old unit. The helicopter touched down with a heavy thud, the skids biting into the asphalt. Even before the blades began to slow, the side door slid open. Three men in tactical gear, their faces etched with a razor-sharp intensity and covered in grime, leaped onto the pad. They weren't looking for the chief of surgery. They weren't looking for Mr. Sterling. They were scanning the area for the one person they knew could hold the world together when it started to bleed out. If you think people are often judged by titles instead of experience, type unfair. The hospital entrance became a scene of controlled chaos. Mr. Sterling, seeing the military uniforms and the high-profile landing, hurried out the doors, adjusting his tie and smoothing his hair. He assumed there had been a massive training accident on the base, and they were bringing in overflow. He saw it as a high-visibility public relations opportunity to show how Pacific View served the military. "Gentlemen!" Sterling shouted over the roar and whine of the cooling engines, his voice reaching for an authority he didn't possess. "I am the hospital administrator. How can we assist the Navy today? We have our trauma team standing by, and I can personally guide you to—" The lead man, a senior chief with a thick beard and eyes that had seen too much darkness, brushed past Sterling as if he were made of air. He didn't even acknowledge the man's title or his outstretched hand. He was focused entirely on the line of nurses and staff standing near the glass doors. His presence was a physical weight, the aura of a man who dealt in life and death, not budgets and schedules. "Where is she?" the senior chief barked. His voice was a rasping command that silenced the entire area. "Where is who, sir?" Sterling stammered, following him frantically like a moth to a flame. "We have our most senior surgical residents ready to assist." "Emily Carter," the operator interrupted. He stopped and turned, his hand gripping a ruggedized tablet. "We were told she's on this shift. We checked the GPS on her last login. Where is Nurse Carter?" The staff went deathly silent. All eyes drifted toward the parking lot, where Emily was still standing next to her old dented sedan. Her box of belongings was resting on the hood. She looked like a common citizen, someone who had just been discarded by the Pacific View system. The contrast was jarring. The elite warriors of the nation searching for the woman the hospital had just called redundant. Sterling blinked, his mouth hanging open. The irony was a physical weight. Emily Carter? "Sir, there must be some mistake. She's just an extra nurse. We actually just processed her out. She's no longer on the staff. She wasn't quite the right fit for our leadership initiatives." The senior chief's face turned into a mask of cold, concentrated fury. He took a single predatory step toward Sterling, looming over the smaller man. "You fired her? Today? On this shift?" "It was a budget decision, sir. She doesn't have the senior certifications or the visibility we require for our long-term growth." The senior chief didn't let him finish. He didn't need to hear about growth. He turned toward his team, his voice a low growl. "She's right there, on the car. Move!" The three operators sprinted across the parking lot, their heavy boots thudding on the pavement in a perfect unison. Emily didn't flinch as they approached. She set her box down on the pavement and stood with her hands at her sides, her shoulders square. Her posture shifted in an instant. The extra nurse vanished. In her place was the doc, the woman who had saved their lives a dozen times in places with no names. "Doc," the senior chief said as he reached her. He didn't salute. They were in a civilian area, but he stood before her with a level of profound respect that Sterling had never shown to another human being. It was the respect of an equal. "Chief," Emily replied, her voice steady, low, and devoid of the fatigue she had felt moments ago. "What happened? You don't land a Seahawk for a routine transfer or a simple fracture. Training accident at the range. Compound blast injury. We've got a brother in that bird who's bottoming out fast. The base surgeons are currently in a conference in D.C., and the on-call team at the Naval Hospital are just residents. They don't have the experience with this kind of localized pressure trauma." He looked her in the eye, his gaze stripped of all bravado. "We remembered what you did at Ridge 404. We remembered how you held Miller together when his chest was open and the air was full of lead. We don't need a surgeon with a fancy title, Emily. We need our doc. We need the calmest mind we know." The hospital staff watched from the doors, mesmerized. Mr. Sterling scrambled over, breathless, his face a cocktail of fear and embarrassment. Now hold on. Emily is no longer an employee here. If there's an emergency, we have liability protocols. She can't just operate or provide care under our roof if she's not officially on the insurance roster. The senior chief turned his head slowly, a predatory movement that made Sterling stop mid-sentence. Liability? This man in that bird has a wife and 3 daughters. He has a hole in his lung that's leaking air into his chest cavity at a rate your machines won't even track. Emily Carter is the only person within 500 miles who has performed a field thoracotomy under fire while being shot at. He looked back at Emily. Will you come? The command takes full responsibility. We just need you to save him. Emily didn't look at Sterling. She didn't look at the hospital that had judged her as surplus. She looked at the helicopter, where a young medic was frantically pumping a manual ventilator. She could see the blood on the deck from where she stood. I need my kit, Emily said, and I need a fresh pair of trauma shears. My old ones are in that box. Chief, tell the pilot to prep for a high-altitude climb. We need to stabilize the pressure differential before we head to the base hospital. We have everything you need on the bird, Doc, the chief said. Emily stepped toward the helicopter. She dropped her civilian jacket on the ground, revealing the focused, disciplined professional that had been hiding under the extra nurse label for months. As she climbed into the bird, she didn't look back. The extra was gone. The doc was back in the fight. If you realize someone's story may be bigger than their job title, type, I was wrong. The interior of the Seahawk was a world of vibrating gray metal, the smell of hydraulic fluid, and the heavy copper scent of fresh blood. On the floor, strapped into a tactical litter, a young operator named Jax was pale, his skin clammy and the color of wet ash. His chest was moving in shallow, paradoxical gasps, a sign that his rib cage had lost its structural integrity. The flight medic, a capable but clearly overwhelmed young man, looked up as Emily climbed in, his eyes wide with relief. He's bottoming out, Doc, the medic shouted over the roar of the engines as the pilot pulled the collective, lifting them into the sky. I've tried 2 needle decompressions, but the seal keeps failing because of the internal tissue damage. There's too much debris in the wound for a standard vent. His heart is shifting. Emily dropped to her knees next to Jax. She didn't ask questions about how it happened. She didn't need a story. She needed data. She placed her hand on the man's neck, feeling for a carotid pulse. It was thready, racing, a heart trying to pump against a massive tension pneumothorax. The pressure in his chest was literally squashing his heart, preventing it from filling with blood. I need a scalpel and a 3-way valve. Now, Emily commanded. Her voice had changed. It was no longer the soft, polite voice of a floor nurse. It was the doc voice, resonant, calm, and absolute. It was a frequency that cut through the mechanical noise of the helicopter. The operators watched in silence, their hands gripping the handrails until their knuckles turned white. They had seen Emily work before, in places where the sky was filled with tracers instead of California clouds. They knew that when she spoke, the chaos in the room stopped. She worked with a precision that was almost hypnotic, while the helicopter banked hard to return to the base, fighting through the morning thermals. Emily was performing a procedure that most civilian nurses wouldn't even be allowed to witness, let alone perform. She wasn't just following orders. She was analyzing the physics of the trauma. She saw the way the blast had pushed carbon fiber fragments from the gear into the pleura. She knew that if she didn't create a permanent, large-bore vent now, Jax would be brain dead before they touched down. Steady the bird, she shouted to the cockpit. We're hitting turbulence from the coast, the pilot yelled back. I don't care. Level it for 10 seconds. Give me a stable deck. For those 10 seconds, the world became very small, focused down to a 3-inch circle of skin on Jax's chest. The roar of the engines faded into a dull hum in Emily's mind. There was only the sound of Jax's struggling breath and the steady, surgical click of Emily's instruments. She made the incision between the 5th and 6th ribs. She guided the tube past the obstruction, her fingers sensing the resistance and navigating through it by feel. A sudden, sharp hiss of pressurized air filled the cabin. Jax's chest immediately began to rise and fall in a regular, deep rhythm. The monitor, which had been flatlining into a dangerous rhythm, began to beep with a steady, strengthening pulse. Emily didn't celebrate. She didn't even smile. She began securing the site with the same methodical focus she used to organize her charts at Pacific View. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead: antibiotics, internal imaging, and post-op recovery. She checked the seal of the chest bag, ensured the drainage was clear, and monitored his pupil response. The senior chief exhaled a breath he had been holding since they left the range. He looked at Emily, then at his fallen brother. "You still got it, Doc. Better than anyone I've seen in a scrub suit." Emily looked up, her face splattered with a few drops of blood. "He needs the surgical suite at the base immediately. Tell them to have 2 units of O-negative ready and a cardiothoracic specialist on standby. He's lost more volume than the external wounds suggest. We need to move." As the helicopter approached the naval base, Emily looked out the small window. She could see the Pacific View Hospital in the distance, a small, insignificant building surrounded by a parking lot. She thought about Sterling and his spreadsheets. She thought about the budget that couldn't afford an extra nurse because she didn't have enough visibility. It was a strange reality. In one building, she was a surplus to be discarded. In another, she was the pivot point of a man's entire existence. One man saw a quiet nurse, the other saw the only person who could bring his friend back from the edge. When they landed at the base, the medical team was waiting. A Navy surgeon, a captain with 30 years of experience, ran to the side of the bird. He looked at the field thoracotomy Emily had performed. He checked the stable vitals on the monitor and the placement of the vent. He looked at Emily, recognizing her immediately from a previous tour in the Pacific. "Carter? I thought you retired to the quiet life in the suburbs." "I tried to, sir," Emily said, stepping out of the bird, her hand still steady. "But apparently, the quiet life is a bit too loud for me." "Thank God for that," the surgeon said, shaking her hand firmly. "This is textbook. You just saved this boy's life, Doc. Come on, I want you in the theater for the cleanup. I want the best eyes on this case." Emily followed them into the base hospital. She didn't look back at the helicopter. She didn't think about her car in the hospital parking lot or her box of belongings. She was back in the X. She was back where the code mattered more than the title, and where the extra was the only person who could do the job. Hours later, after Jax was safely in recovery and his wife had been notified, Emily sat in the base lounge. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a deep, familiar exhaustion. The senior chief walked in, carrying 2 cups of black coffee. He handed her one and sat down on the bench beside her. "I heard about the hospital," he said quietly. "The way they treated you." Sterling called the CO, trying to clarify the situation. He was scared of the fallout. Emily took a sip of the coffee. "I don't know, Chief. I like the quiet. I like the idea of just being Nurse Carter. I thought I could leave the war behind." "Doc," the chief said, his voice firm, "you can hide in a small hospital all you want. You can pretend you're just an extra. But the world has a way of finding the people it needs. You aren't an extra. You're the anchor, and you can't fight who you are. If you believe true experience never disappears, type, 'I owe you.'" The next day, Emily returned to the Pacific View Medical Center to pick up her final paycheck in her car. The atmosphere had changed completely. As she walked through the lobby, the staff didn't look away this time. The whispering was constant, but it wasn't about her being fired. It was about the helicopter. It was about the black tactical gear. It was about the men who had come for her. Word had spread like wildfire. The quiet nurse from the overflow shift was actually a legendary combat medic. The story of the field surgery in the back of a shaking Seahawk had become hospital lore overnight, told and retold by the intern and the guards who had seen her walk into the rotors without fear. Emily walked toward the administration office. Before she could reach the door, it opened. Mr. Sterling stepped out, looking significantly less confident than he had 24 hours ago. His tie was slightly crooked, and his visibility leader, persona, had been replaced by visible, sweating anxiety. "Emily," he said, his voice forced and high-pitched. "I was just about to call you. There's been, well, a massive misunderstanding. We've reviewed the budget again, and it turns out we have plenty of room for your position. In fact, We'd like to offer you a lead role in the ER training department. We need your unique experience." Emily stopped and looked at him. She saw the fear in his eyes. Not fear for Jack's or for the mission, but fear for his own reputation. He had realized he had fired a woman who was more qualified than half his senior staff, and the Navy was already asking questions about why she was available in the first place. "Mr. Sterling," Emily said calmly, her voice echoing in the hallway, "yesterday you told me I was an extra. You told me I wasn't a visibility leader. You were right about one thing. I'm not a leader who needs to be seen. I'm a professional who needs to be ready." "Emily, please," Sterling pleaded, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The story about the SEALs. It's all over the local news. If people find out we let you go because of a budget cut while you were the only one who could save that man, it looks terrible for the hospital's image." "It is terrible for the hospital's image," Emily replied. "Not because of me, but because of the way you judge people. You looked at my file and saw a nurse who didn't talk enough at the meetings. You didn't look at the patient care. You didn't look at the reliability. You only looked at the title on the folder." Emily reached into her bag and pulled out her resignation letter, the one she had written the night before. She set it on his desk. "I'm moving on," Emily said. "The Navy base has offered me a position as a senior instructor for their tactical teams. They don't care about my visibility. They care about my results." As she walked out of the office, she saw the young intern who had watched her walk out yesterday. He looked at her with wide eyes, holding a trauma manual. "Is it true?" he whispered. "Did you really perform a thoracotomy in a moving helicopter?" Emily stopped and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Titles don't save people, Jax." Yes, that was his name too. "Knowledge does. Study your trauma manuals. Don't wait for a title to become an expert." She walked out the front doors. She picked up her box from the hood of her car. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of absolute clarity. She had tried to be normal. She had tried to be an extra. But she realized now that there is no such thing as an extra person in the world of the calm mind. Every soul is essential. Every skill is a weapon against the chaos. She drove away, looking in the rearview mirror as the hospital grew smaller. She was going back to the base. She was going back to the place where Doc was the only title that mattered. If you believe humility often hides the greatest experience, type, "I will live with honor." In our modern world, we are taught to value the loud. We are taught that the person with the most followers, the most degrees, or the most impressive title is the one who deserves the most respect. We judge books by their covers every single day, dismissing those who don't shout their accomplishments from the rooftops, assuming their silence is a sign of insignificance. But the story of Emily Carter is a reminder of a deeper, more profound truth. True competence is often quiet. It doesn't need to brag. It doesn't need to prove itself to an administrator with a spreadsheet. Real skill is found in the steady hands and the focused gaze of someone who has stared into the absolute chaos of existence and refused to blink. It is the result of thousands of hours of unseen study and a commitment to the mission above the self. In the military, they have a saying, "Beware the quiet ones." It's not a threat. It's a warning about underestimating the power of a disciplined mind. The people who solve the hardest problems, the ones who hold the world together when the plans fall apart, are rarely the ones seeking the spotlight. They are the ones in the back of the room, observing, learning, and waiting for the moment they are needed. Emily Carter didn't fail the hospital failed her. It failed to see that a resume is a poor metric for a person's soul. It failed to recognize that the true value of a nurse is measured in heartbeats and clarity, not in budget percentages. When you look at the people around you, your colleagues, your friends, or the strangers you pass on the street, remember Doc. Remember that the person you might be dismissing as just an extra might be the same person who would crawl through fire to save you without ever asking for a thank you or a medal. Respect isn't given to the rank. It's given to the character. It's given to the actions that happen when no one is watching, and there is no reward other than the life saved itself. Emily Carter eventually left the civilian world behind for good. She became the lead instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Center, training the next generation of docs. She never raised her voice. She never sought the cameras or the news crews. She just taught them how to be the silence in the storm. She taught them that the highest calling is to be ready when the world breaks. Always look deeper. Always value the quiet professional. Because one day, the rotors will begin to thrum, the sky will turn gray, and you'll find yourself praying for someone like Emily Carter to reach out and hold your world together. If you believe the quiet professionals who solve the hardest problems deserve recognition, leave a comment and subscribe to the Veteran Story. We tell the stories behind the calm minds that change everything.